Hi, everyone, and welcome to Rolling into Higher Education, Going to College with Paralysis. Today's webinar will be presented by Patricia Correa, Associate Manager of Information Services and Translation at the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation, and Annie Tulkin, the founder and director of Accessible College. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on the Reeve Foundation YouTube channel. To turn on closed captions, please click the CC button located on your Zoom screen. I am now going to turn it over to Patricia. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming today to Rolling into Higher Education, Going to College with Paralysis. Here at the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation, we are very happy to introduce Annie Tulkin, the founder of Accessible College, to talk to us about all the benefits and all the little secrets that you may need to make your higher education experience the best one possible. Let me introduce you now to Annie, who will start our presentation.
Thanks. Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. We're really happy and excited to be here with you all. I'm Annie Tulkin. I'm the founder and director of Accessible College. I've joined up with the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation, and we have a really fantastic program to tell you all about. We're going to dive into a few pieces of data and information, and then we're going to go into some Q&A. Kind of in the middle of the presentation, which should be a fun twist for everybody who's used to the questions being at the end. If you have questions during the presentation, you can feel free to just put them in the Q&A down in the Zoom bar. You should find the Q&A down there, so you can put them in the Q&A and we will answer those questions. The webinar is being recorded, as was mentioned. It'll be available on the Reeve Foundation YouTube channel. So let's go ahead and jump on in. So as I mentioned, I'm Annie Tulkin. I'm the founder and director of Accessible College. And the mission of Accessible College is to provide students with physical disabilities and health conditions, support and services to ensure a successful transition into higher education. So at Accessible College, we work with students with a variety of health conditions like lupus, POTS, autoimmune disorders, cancer, diabetes, and also students with mental health conditions. And we work with students with physical disabilities, such as students who use wheelchairs, students who use mobility devices, and students with visual impairments and hearing impairments as well. And the reason that we do this is because we know that colleges and universities provide varying levels of supports for students with disabilities. And so the work that we do at Accessible College helps to bridge those gaps and really empower students and families for positive educational experiences. So a little bit about me. I have over 10 years of experience in the disability field. Nearly 6 of those years were as the associate director of the Disability Support Office at Georgetown University, which is called the Academic Resource Center. My background is in education and special education. I was a Peace Corps volunteer and a Fulbright Fellow, both in Mongolia. But the real catalyst for me to start my work and start this business, Accessible College, was the time I spent at Georgetown. So at Georgetown, I worked with undergraduate, graduate, and medical school students with physical disabilities and health conditions. And those were students who were seeking accommodations. And I was the person who was engaging with those students in the accommodations process, which is also known as the interactive process. So I was reviewing documentation. I was helping students to make sure that they had reasonable accommodations in place. I was also in charge of all the housing accommodations too. And I oversaw all of the academic support services for the general student body at Georgetown as well. So that really gave me some insights into some of the experiences that students specifically with physical disabilities were having coming into the college setting. One of the things that I recognized was that there was a lot of misinformation, and then there was a lot of lack of knowledge too on the part of the students and families in terms of what their role was in the accommodations process, what types of accommodations they could request in the college setting, and what the expectations were on the student. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that today, in addition to taking all of your questions as well. So first, let me tell you about this amazing project that I have with the Reeve Foundation. We started this collaboration last year in September 2020. I guess this is the 1-year anniversary of our project together. And through this partnership, Accessible College, I will provide one-on-one consultations for students with paralysis who are thinking about or transitioning to college. And the way that you would get into this program is to contact the Reeve Foundation. And I've put the number for the information specialist there. It's up on the screen. It's 1-800-539-7309. You can also go to the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation website and connect with the information specialist that way as well. There are a limited number of spaces available, but it's a free service, and we just want to make sure that families know it's available. And I know last year, a lot of people asked me, do you work with adult students too, who are transitioning back to college, who are maybe trying to think about vocational schools, or if they want to get back into a university or college experience? And the answer is yes. So all you have to do is contact the information specialist and kind of talk through what your needs are, and they'll connect you with me. And we'll talk a little bit more about the specifics of what happens during those sessions a little bit later on in the presentation. I wanted to offer you some data to kind of contextualize this conversation about the transition to college for students with paralysis, because I think it's important data for us to be grounded in. So the federal data indicates that approximately 19% of undergraduate college students report having a disability. And so that includes learning disabilities, ADD, mobility impairments, psychiatric, mental health conditions, and health conditions. And we know that this is the number of students who have gone to the Disability Support Office and requested accommodation. So that's where that data is pulled from. So you can imagine that there's actually probably a higher number of students with disabilities who are on college campuses, but either haven't gone through the process to request accommodations, either because they don't know they could receive accommodations, or they don't feel like they'll need accommodations. So they've chosen not to request accommodations. But that makes people with disabilities probably the largest minority group on any given college campus, just like people with disabilities are the largest minority group in the United States. So that's just really important data to kind of keep in mind in terms of framing of thinking about, are students with disabilities on college campuses? And the answer is absolutely yes, they are there. We know that through the numbers. We also know that approximately 7% of college students who report having a disability report having a physical disability or a mobility impairment. And that could be a lot of things, right? So some of those people might have more visible disabilities. They might be wheelchair users or mobility device users. They might have a prosthetic limb. So there's a couple different people who might kind of fit into that category. But it's also important to note that more and more students, since the passage of the ADA, which we just capped off 31 years since the passage of the ADA, there are more and more students with disabilities and physical disabilities who are going on to college. Most of these students have grown up in the IDEA era, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act era. So they've gone into mainstream schools and they've been included in education. And the reason that I feel like this data is just important is because people often think that they're alone in this process. And I share this data so that you know that you're not alone. There are a lot of people who are going on to college with disabilities, and I feel like it's important to just share that as a framing. So just briefly, I wanted to touch base on the laws. So first, this is just to give us kind of a grounding in what we're all talking about. So first, you have IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And this is the law that governs special education supports and services for students in the K through 12 setting. So if the student has what's known as an IEP, an individualized education program or plan, it's because of IDEA, it's because of this law. If your student is in a private school, or those schools are not bound by IDEA, but those schools are bound by Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, which protects against discrimination on the basis of a disability. So the student might have a 504 plan that outlines their accommodations instead of an IEP. Private and public schools both adhere to Section 504, and it applies to the K through 12 setting all the way through college. When your student graduates from high school and moves on to college, the accommodations process is then governed by the Americans with Disabilities Act. And that provides for reasonable accommodations in the college setting. So that might be different. Those accommodations might be different than what they may have received in the high school setting. And that's just an important nuance. A big difference between high school and college is that in college, the student has to be engaged in that interactive process and requesting their own accommodations and really engaged in their own self-advocacy. So in high school, typically parents are very involved, engaging and connecting with teachers and administrators and advocating on behalf of the student. But when the student gets to college, if they're seeking accommodations, they need to be able to do that by themselves. And that requires a lot of time and preparation and a very intentional approach. And that's a lot of the work that I do with students and families, is preparing them for that, for having those conversations about what their needs are, for being able to talk about their disabilities, to be able to actually problem solve when they're in that situation as well. And the final law that I wanted to outline here is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, Federal Educational Rights and Privacy Act. I always get that wrong. And that's the law that typically surprises parents, which is probably why my brain loops it back to families. And that law is called FERPA. And so FERPA is the law that prevents the college from sharing information about your student. That could be grades, class schedules, disciplinary actions. So a lot of families connect with their student, have a conversation, and they might decide to sign what is known as a FERPA waiver with the college, which gives the family access to the student's grades and their academic history and all of that information. So I say that just so that you know that that's something that exists and that you might want to be aware of. So just briefly, I wanted to give an overview of the differences in accommodations between high school and college, because a lot of families are not super aware of how this change actually looks in practice. So in high school, students with disabilities are identified by the school. The teachers and administrators usually know what the accommodations are. They're defined in an IEP, a 504 plan, or an academic plan. But in college, it's the student's responsibility to disclose that disability, provide documentation to the Disability Support Office, have those conversations with professors. So the student needs to be comfortable talking about their needs and talking about their disability. In high school, the school usually takes the lead in arranging accommodations. So if the student gets extra time on a test or needs a note taker, the school knows and they make those arrangements for the student. But in college, the student has to be the one who's engaging in that interactive process, arranging those accommodations. So that requires the student to meet with the people in the Disability Support Office, to have a conversation, to provide the documentation. And building off that extra time on test example, at the college level, most schools have a place where students with disabilities can go and take exams in a separate setting so that they can provide the accommodations that students need. That usually requires students to make a reservation to take that exam there 7 to 3 days in advance. So that requires a lot of intentional planning. It requires organizational skills. So those are some things that students get sometimes a little bit tripped up about when they enter the college setting, because they didn't have to do these things necessarily in their high school setting. And so that's why students and families really need to be proactive about planning and preparing and making sure that students have the organizational and executive function skills to be able to manage these things independently in college. And finally, usually in high school, the teachers can connect with the family and let them know if the student needs support. They can share information, things like that. But in college, the student has to be proactive in seeking out support services. So that might mean going to office hours if their professor has them. It could be hiring tutors or taking advantage of other supports that their college offers, like a writing center or peer tutoring or peer support services. And that's a really big shift for a lot of students because they have to be able to identify when something's not working or when they need support. And this is where a lot of students experience some challenges. So that's why it's really critical to start working with students on these skills as early as possible so that they can be prepared for that college transition. And lastly, just something I wanted to add on here. We know that transition services, if your student is coming from the high school setting, can really vary from school to school, from school district to school district. If your student has an IEP, if they're in high school, then transition is typically a part of the conversation. It's supposed to be a part of the conversation. But if they have a 504 plan, which many students that I work with who use wheelchairs have 504 plans, they don't have IEPs, transition is not usually a part of that conversation. Kind of just depends on who the student's counselor is and what school they're going to, but it's not always a part of the conversation. So these students in particular, and students with more significant physical disabilities, really need a more specialized, targeted approach and someone to kind of connect with and talk through all the accommodations pieces, all of the housing and preparation pieces. And that's what I offer through Accessible College. And that's why we're really excited to bring you this collaboration between the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation and myself so that we can get more students who experience paralysis into the college setting and prepped for what that looks like, right? I wanted to give you some examples just of types of accommodations and considerations for students with paralysis, because sometimes we're so focused on academic stuff, we forget about all of the other aspects of college life, and college life is quite robust. So we talked a little bit about that process for requesting accommodations. So the student going into the disability support office, these days it's calling or Zooming or emailing them, and disclosing a disability and providing documentation. For most students with paralysis, that documentation is typically a letter from their healthcare provider that outlines the student's needs, their diagnosis, their needs, and the types of accommodations that they may need in the college setting. Your student might also want to provide a copy of their IEP or their 504 plan. Most colleges and universities won't accept that as a primary form of documentation, but it is helpful historic documentation to let the school know, to let that college know, what types of accommodations the student had in high school, which can really inform their process and thinking through the types of accommodations that might be reasonable in the college setting. Another thing I want to add just before I dive into this slide is that when you're looking at colleges, you should always go to the Disability Support Office website. The Disability Support Office might have a different name. It could be called Student Disability Services. It could be called Accessibility Services. Usually you can get to the Disability Support Office website by just going to the college's main website and putting in disability support. And that should bring up the website that you're looking for. There, you'll usually find documentation guidelines, an outline of what their process is. And each school, each college can have their own process and their own documentation guidelines. So it's really important that you're doing that work ahead of time and looking up that information. So here are some examples of accommodations that students with paralysis might be considering for college. So it could be things like extra time for tests, priority registration, which would allow them to choose classes that work with their schedule. And that might be because they have a personal care attendant or they have some personal needs that they need to tend to throughout the day. And having priority registration can give them more flexibility to choose class times that'll work for their needs. Allowing a laptop in class, that might be for note taking. It could be for recording. You might be thinking, who doesn't allow a laptop in their classroom? And you'd be surprised because some college professors don't allow laptops in classrooms unless the student has an accommodation. Classroom relocation could be a reasonable accommodation depending on the college, because students might need classes that are closer together, or they might need to have their classes in certain buildings that are more accessible or that they can independently access. So those types of questions can be really important when you're working with a disability support office. flexible attendance in case the student is unable to attend class or has a medical need that they have to tend to. So, or it could be bad weather. I've actually had a lot of students who've chosen to go to schools in places that have lots of snow or lots of rain. And so that could be really challenging for them to actually get to class. And so they might need this flexible attendance accommodation to be able to let their professor know that they're not just missing class, that they actually had a reason why they are unable to attend class. And the other thing that I want to talk to a little bit about is the residential setting, because it's often left till the last minute. So there's a couple things. Most colleges have a housing accommodation process. So usually once a student is committed to this school, so most schools have a May 1st commitment deadline. Once you sign that dotted line and the student has decided to go to that school, the clock kind of starts ticking for the housing stuff. Usually schools require that students apply for housing accommodations pretty soon. Most have deadlines in early June. And so you want to make sure that you're kind of on top of that if your student is considering living in a dormitory setting or a residence hall setting. That's what we call them these days. So you might be requesting things like an ADA accessible room, a lower floor, a centralized location. It could be requesting a personal care attendant to be able to live with the student or to be able to get into the dorm. One thing I should note is that colleges don't provide one-on-one aides like some students with paralysis may have had in high school, supporting and assisting them throughout the day. That's not an accommodation that colleges will provide. If the student needs a personal care attendant for bathing, dressing, getting their books and things together, that's something that students will either have to hire independently, or there are two schools currently that have kind of built-in personal care attendant services. One is the University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana, and the other one is Wright State in Ohio. And so they have personal care attendant services at both of those schools, but outside of those schools, the student will have to hire their own personal care attendant or bring their own personal care attendant if it's a family member who's going to be supporting them. The other things to kind of think about is the accessibility of the space to the student, right? So we all know on this call, highly likely that everybody understands that sometimes what is technically compliant or ADA compliant is not always compliant for the student. And so you want to make sure that you're choosing a school and working with people who want to make that experience best for your student. And so asking questions about how the space is set up and seeing if they can move things or adjust things. Those are all reasonable requests, and those are conversations that you can have with the disability support offices. In terms of recreation activities, a lot of students might be interested in adaptive fitness equipment or, a pool, chairlift for the pool, or having the same access to the student center facilities that their other peers have. So that could be like adaptive gaming equipment or other types of adaptive equipment, or it could just be moving things around so that there's actually accessible spaces where students can get through. There are some schools that have recreation programs and wheelchair basketball teams and volleyball teams and adaptive fitness teams and sports. So if you're interested in that, there is some information that I can share in the chat box on looking for schools that have those teams as well. There might be some accommodations that students want to look at in terms of dining. So that could be things like allergy-free or gluten-free, or if your student has a specific diet that they're on, you would need to request that accommodation through dining services at the individual schools. So if you're looking at schools, that might be something that you want to pursue ahead of time and have those conversations up front to make sure that the school can actually meet your students' needs. It could be support assistance in the dining hall, with food selection or with carrying a tray. So those are all conversations that you'd want to start upfront with the disability support offices to see what sorts of supports and services could be available for your student. And finally, programmatic accommodations. This is something that we don't always think about. But it could be things like accessible seating or accessible transportation. A lot of schools have sports teams that play in stadiums that are actually off campus. And it's important for students to know that if transportation is being offered to every other student, then accessible transportation should also be available for students who need it. And that's something that they would want to connect with the disability support offices and ask about, so that they can attend with their peers. And so I think those are just kind of a brief, this is not a comprehensive list. It's just kind of a brief summary, some ideas of things that people might want to be thinking about. And I am going to hand it over to Trish now for some conversation and Q&A. And as we're having this conversation and Q&A, I'm actually going to stop my screen share for a second, and I'm going to put a couple resources into the chat box for everybody. And one of those resources is a transition guide that I wrote for the Reeve Foundation on navigating the transition to college. And the other resource that I'm going to put in there is from New Mobility Magazine, and it's a resource on the 20 most wheelchair friendly campuses. So I'll put both of those in there so folks can have it. And Trish, I'll hand it over to you so you can start fielding questions. And if people have questions, you can put them in the Q&A. We are happy to answer them.
Thank you, Annie.
Sure.
So really, it's amazing all the information you have provided. As you can imagine that a lot of parents and students are looking at all these laws and all these accommodations, and in the meantime, trying to figure out what type of college they want to go and what major they want to pursue. It's really overwhelming. So let me ask you some questions. The first one that I have is, what do you think are some of the challenges that students with paralysis may have while they're navigating this college process?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges is kind of weighing out how important physical accessibility is versus finding a school that has the major that you want. Because, students with paralysis are just like every other student. They want to go to a school that has the school culture that they like, that has the major that they're interested in, that has the events and social life that they may or may not be interested in. And so sometimes it's hard for students to kind of figure out, how to navigate the accessibility pieces, because some campuses are far more physically accessible, right? Other campuses might not be as accessible, and sometimes it can be really tricky to weigh out what's more important. So one of the things that I typically tell students to do and families to do is to set up a conversation with the disability support offices, either prior to applying or prior to committing to the school, so you can get a sense of who are the people in that office, what types of services could be offered to your student to kind of mitigate any of the accessibility challenges that they might experience on campus. And then that can give the student a real sense of like, what's it like to actually be on this campus or live on this campus. Same thing that applies, to students. Another thing that might really help is to connect with other students who use wheelchairs who are currently on campus. That can be really, really helpful way to get a sense of like what campus life is actually like for students who use wheelchairs. Sometimes you can ask the disability support office if they'll connect you with students who are currently on campus and use wheelchairs. And that can be really helpful to kind of figure out if that space is going to be a good fit for the student.
Great, thank you. So my next question, it's about what to do before you decide for a college. So what do you think are some of the questions that both the students and the families, as they're either in a tour of the college or they're in the disability office talking to a counselor, should be doing or should be asking more like, to make sure that that it's a good fit, both academically and also so that it meets the supports that they may be looking for?
Yeah, and sometimes that can be the trickiest part, right? Because every college is going to tell you that they are ADA compliant and that they will work with the student to make sure the student has what they need. So as a parent or as a student, you're like, well, great, they're going to be compliant, but what that actually looks like on the ground can be really, really different. So that's why it's really important for students and families to actually go, if you can, if you're able to go and see the school in person, to tour the grounds, to, you know, get a sense of what things are actually like, where the entrances are. That can be really, really helpful. But sometimes I like to work with students and families on creating scenario-based questions to ask the disability support office folks. So that might be around, like, you know, if I encounter a push button that doesn't work, and, you know, my class is starting in 5 minutes and I'm trying to get in the door, like, play out this scenario. What steps would I, the student, have to take to be able to, you know, to get access to that classroom, to let someone know that this isn't working for me. You know, talking about the inclement weather pieces, seeing if you can talk to other students who are using wheelchairs and who are on the campus currently. That can be really, really a helpful thing to do. And I think, like, the questions that families might have are probably unique to their student specific situation. Lots of families have questions around note taking and how note takers are going to work, and making sure that their student is actually getting the information that they need. And that works a little bit differently at each college. So if your student needs a note taker, you're definitely going to want to ask about how that college, what the process is at that college for note takers. If your student uses other types of assistive technology, you definitely want to ask, you know, how that's going to look in the classrooms at that specific place, or what support services may or may not be available on campus for students who use assistive technology. Because that really varies on college campuses too. Some colleges have assistive technology specialists and some don't. For example, at Georgetown, in addition to being the associate director and doing all of the things that I did there, I also did all of the assistive technology. And so, you know, it looks different. And you want to ask about, you know, how many students does the disability support office work with? How many of those students have physical disabilities? How many staff members are there? You know, are they always on call, or how does that work? You know, so there are just some pieces that families might be interested in. And someone actually put a great tip into the Q&A box that I want to answer. And it was just, their suggestion was adjusting, once your student has their schedule for college, actually going to the campus and adjusting to the building and entrance, and adjusting everything to their schedule. So, like, mapping out, looking at the classrooms ahead of time. I often suggest that students try to take a course during the summer semester before their first year, so that they can get used to the college campus without all the people on it, if that's possible. A lot of schools offer summer sessions, and that can be a really good way to just kind of ease into the transition, as opposed to being thrown in when, you know, there's a bunch of first year students running around confused. And so that can be a really helpful tip for people too.
I really liked your scenario question. I feel like it probably will take people a little bit off guard, but it also is going to give you a good idea of those staff members who really know and understand disability. So that's great, and I hope that people in our webinar are going to be able to use it. So talking about that, you actually answered my next question, that what students should be looking for. All those little areas of accessibility are really important. So tell me, what can students who have multiple disabilities do in terms of the search process for colleges, and also talking to the disability offices?
So if the student has multiple disabilities, depending on what those disabilities are, there might be kind of different questions or search aspects that the student might want to include, right? So let's say that the student also has a mental health condition in addition to paralysis. If they're currently seeing a psychologist or a psychiatrist or a therapist locally, they want to think about how those services are going to transition should they move away for college. Sometimes, and that kind of applies to any doctors or specialists that a student might be seeing. Some students choose to kind of narrow their college search around areas that have more doctors or more specialists. That might be state schools or cities, so that there's actually more hospital centers or more medical resources nearby. If your student has conditions that require, medications, you need to be thinking about what is that transfer of medications going to be looking like? Does your student know how to manage their own medications independently? Because that might be a skill that they need to start working on in order to be able to transition to college more independently, whether that's a psychiatric medication or an ADD medication. Students need to be able to kind of manage those meds by themselves when they're in college. And the expectation is that they will be able to take their own medications, get their own refills, and have all of those things set up for when they go to school. So there might be some certain search criteria that families want to kind of add in. But when you're considering the questions you have for the disability support offices, if your student has multiple disabilities, you might just want to factor that into the questions that you're asking. Usually you can ask the people in the disability support office, the generic question of what types of accommodations do you typically offer for students with X condition? And they should be able to give you a general sense of the types of accommodations that students might need. You could also try kind of explaining or listing out the accommodations that your student may receive in high school, and then working through that with them to see what sort of parallel accommodations they might be able to offer. Most colleges will never commit to the accommodations that they will offer your student until they've read through your student's documentation. And that's not until after your student has already committed to the college. So that's just an important thing for families to understand and remember when they're entering into that process.
Thank you. I think that's a really good point that you just made that I'm not 100. I just wanted to highlight is that it's very important that both families and students are working on those skills that they may need. So it's obviously the college is going to be very important and the disability office is going to be extremely helpful. But even starting junior or senior year of high school, these skills are a great thing to start working on. Things like calling your pharmacist so that they can get the refills, or making calendar appointments for these specialists are things that we also have to start thinking about and working to make sure that it's one less thing to worry about in terms of accessibility.
Absolutely.
For bringing that up.
Yeah. So, well, in addition to those kind of like medication focused things and doctor focused things, all of those independent living skills. So like,
Yes.
Can your student, if they have the ability to do their own laundry at home, how does that translate to college? Or can they make simple foods, a sandwich? Do they know how to manage their own bank account? Do they have an ATM card? Those are some of the typical things that, other families are thinking about. And there's just more considerations when someone has paralysis and might have some other needs. So, you might need to just kind of take that typical independent living skills list and add some more pieces to it. And I see a question that came into the chat box too, Trish, about, do you want to read it out?
Sure. So Lucy tells us, do colleges help families to get in touch with CPAs in the area? And how do you find CPAs? Because as most of you guys know, it's really hard to find these personal care attendants most of the times, and especially when we're talking about a college environment.
Yes. And so Lucy's question, do colleges help families get in touch with personal care attendants? It depends on the college. So some colleges actually will keep lists of agencies that other students have worked with. They might have some other suggestions on where students can go to find personal care attendants. But typically, they won't recommend any specific person or agency. They might just have a resource that they give you, and might being the operative word, because a lot of colleges don't even have that. So usually what I recommend that students do is first see if there are other students on campus who have personal care attendants, and see if you can connect with those students. That's number one. The second piece is there's a little bit more to think about in terms of how you're hiring personal care attendants. And this probably gets into some more kind of murky financial territory. But if you're using, Medicaid dollars, or if you have a grant that you're using to pay for them, there might be some specific stipulations on who you have to hire and how you have to hire them. if you're hiring someone, if you're just doing a personal hire, like if your family is paying for it independently, you might be able to go the route of using, Indeed or one of the job search kind of websites where you're actually posting an ad and looking for someone that way. Some students choose to hire other students, which is a model that I actually just worked with a student on. And she ended up hiring a number of nursing students at the university that she's going to. And the nursing students actually help her throughout the day because for toileting and for some other personal care needs, and cleaning and doing laundry and things like that. And then she has an agency that she works with for overnight care. So there's a lot of different models for doing this. And if you look at that transition guide that I put into the chat box, which you can also find on the Reeve Foundation website, I feel like I'm giving a plug. So you can check out that resource too. There's a section in there on PCAs, on how to find a PCA on campus. And this is something I've actually written about extensively. So if you go to my website, which is accessiblecollege.com, there's a lot of information on there as well. But this can be a really tricky thing for students and families to kind of navigate. And one of the hardest pieces is that it usually, once you sign that dotted line in May and you start working on these things don't tend to fall in line until, right up to you're going to school, and then you finally are able to hire that person and get things moving. So the timeline is really quick, and it's not super fun for lots of people. But one of the things that you can start to do now, prior to going away, is start to work with the student to list out what are their care needs, literally hour by hour, day by day. There might be things, especially if you've been living with a younger person with paralysis, that you as a parent or a caregiver do that you don't even realize you do. So starting to write out those things ahead of time so that you've got that information, then you can hand that information over to an agency or use that to inform an ad if you're creating an ad. So those are just some of the steps that you can take now to kind of start getting things prepared and in order for that.
Great, thank you. So I'm gonna switch it a little bit. I want to talk about non-traditional students. So
Sure.
Usually we consider non-traditional students anyone who has spent some time after high school. It could be a couple of years, it could be more, it could be a couple decades. It doesn't really matter, but they're still interested in pursuing higher education, which is an amazing goal. So can you tell me what type of supports are available for people going back to college while living with paralysis, whether it may be a new injury or something that they have had lived with a long time?
Yeah, so for non-traditional students, excuse me, one of the best things to do would be to connect with the Reeve Foundation, connect with some of the mentors, because a lot of people who've been through that experience before can really give students some perspective on what things they should be considering and thinking about. So that's kind of one place to go. The other thing is for students to start connecting with some of the state resources that might be available to them. So that could be vocational rehabilitation, or it could be their state's division on aging and disability. They have different names in different states. So you just want to look up what resources your state has for disability, and also for education or for training, because lots of states have specific training programs or resources available for training for people with disabilities. You might also want to connect with your local Center for Independent Living. They are in, I think, every state and territory. And so they can also be a great place to kind of look for some of those resources that might be available. But the other thing is that, through this Reeve Foundation project, I've had the privilege of working with a number of adult students who who were considering going back to college. We actually did a webinar last December with a student, Chris, and people can go back and find that. We can put that link somewhere, either in the chat box, or we can send it back out to folks who've attended today. And he is an adult student who was considering going back to college to get some new training. And one of the things that was challenging for him was thinking about the types of accommodations that he would need. And so the work that he and I did together was actually thinking through what are the types of accommodations that you might want to request, because he had not been back to school as a person in a wheelchair. And so we kind of problem solved and thought through those pieces so that he can then go back to the school's disability support office to actually make that request for accommodations. And so you might want to connect with the schools too that you're interested in to see if there are any supports that they have that might be available as well. And I'm seeing some questions come in, and these are some that I can answer pretty about scholarship opportunities. And I think that transition guide that I wrote for the Reeve Foundation does have some resources on paralysis specific scholarship opportunities that might be available for students. So you can check that. I also posted the New Mobility 20 Wheelchair Friendly Colleges Guide, and that also has a section on scholarships as well. You might also want to look to condition specific organizations, because a lot of those organizations have scholarships too for students. So that might be something to check out. And Lucy asked about connecting with, maybe this is about vocational rehabilitation in the home state or the college state. Start with your home state and see where it goes. Different states have different policies, and I don't want to give any misinformation. So start with your home state and kind of see where it takes you. They might direct you to another state. Some states have reciprocity agreements, so there's a lot of ins and outs when it comes to state funding and federal funding and reciprocity. And there's a great question here about virtual schools for people with mobility impairments. And that's a great question. I think now more than ever, there are more options for students to get a college education online. You just want to make sure that I'm not going to recommend any specific school. You're just going to want to make sure that you're vetting these schools and looking for places that are actually accredited, and reading student reviews of some of the online schools. That's another area too, where you might want to connect with some of the mentors at the Reeve Foundation to see if anybody has had any experiences with some of the online schools. Because that's also an area where there's a lot of schools that might not be on the up and up. And so you want to make sure that you're actually getting an education that's going to be worth something. So doing your due diligence and doing your research is going to be really important. Those schools, as they are operating in the United States, and many of them probably also receive federal funding as well, they also have to be ADA compliant. So if there are things that you need related to online education, accommodations that you might need, you should make sure that you're talking to the disability support offices at the online colleges as well. Let's see, and I'm seeing some other questions.
So thank you very much, Annie. I think that's great. And the last question that I had, you already answered. It was about funding, so I really appreciate it. I do have some questions from our participants. So Yvette asks us, how does a student who lives with paralysis can work or self-advocate if there's no disability service office in existence?
So every school that receives federal funding, which is like a majority of the colleges and universities in the United States, unless it's a private school that doesn't receive any federal funding, and that's like, there aren't very many of them. They should all have either a disability support office or a point person who is in charge of processing student accommodation requests. So at some schools that might be like a dean of students, or it could be an advisor. So every school will have someone who's in charge of the accommodations process. So you'd be hard pressed to find a school that doesn't have anybody who is in charge of that process. Now, that doesn't mean that they're always going to know what types of accommodations a student with paralysis is going to need. And that's where, this is a perfect segue, because that's where working with me to kind of work through these pieces could be really helpful. So I'm bringing my slides back up because I mentioned that Accessible College, I have a partnership with the Reeve Foundation for students who are transitioning to college. They could be of any age, and to sign up and to have a free consultation, you can contact the Reeve information specialist. And I put the number up here, 800-539-7309, or you can go to christopherreeve.org/ask and connect with the information specialist. And through that process, I'm able to work with students. And here's what we do. We work together. I'll do a quick intake with the student and the family if the student's still in high school. We do one-on-one 1-hour meetings via Zoom or phone, up to 3 sessions. So this is a great primer to kind of get students thinking about what their needs might be in the college setting. And it's all customized. So I really work with the student to figure out what are the needs that you have? What do we need to be thinking about? We create customized documents to support the student. So you'd actually get, the list of accommodations, the list of questions you should be thinking through, any other supporting information that we create together, I give to the student. And after every session, when we meet, I do an email recap of the things that we covered, a kind of to-do list if there's anything that the student and the family needs to like follow up on or figure out. And so we're really partnering and working through, what are the needs? Where do we need to go? How do we need to get there? And we're doing that together. So it creates some accountability as well. And so there's the contact information again. And I also put up my contact information as well as my website, which is accessiblecollege.com. And I'm on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, so people can find me there too. And I see another, I see some questions that came in. Do I work with grad students? Absolutely. I have grad students through the Reeve Foundation program now and through my private practice as well. Let's see, and there was a comment just about being a non-traditional student. It'd be very difficult to be a student and self-advocate. And this is something that I talk with students about all the time. It's known as self-advocacy fatigue, right? Because a lot of students with visible and invisible disabilities are often having to advocate and re-advocate for themselves, even when they receive accommodations. A lot of the work that I do with students too is thinking about how can we create some systems so that you're not having to constantly re-advocate. And so some of that too is just finding the right fit in terms of disability support offices in schools and making sure that you have a supportive school setting. And that can be really, really helpful for students to have in their court. And also just creating those peer connections as well, whether it's through the Reeve Foundation or there are some other organizations. There's one called DREAM, which is part of the National Center for Students with Disabilities. They have a peer connection, peer network group that meets. And there's another group called the Health Advocacy Summit, which is made up of students with health conditions. They also have a peer connection group. So that's a great place to kind of meet with and connect with other college age students who are experiencing the same things, because this is something that that self-advocacy fatigue is something that a lot of college students with disabilities are experiencing. And students might be interested in also looking at schools that have disability cultural centers. There are 5 schools now that have disability cultural centers. I recently wrote a blog post on this, and I can share it with the Reeve Foundation folks to put out when we send out the recap email. But some of those schools have disability cultural centers in addition to having a disability support office. And those disability cultural centers can be a really valuable place for students with disabilities to connect, to learn about disability rights, to learn about disability history, and to have some conversations, about ableism and about their personal experiences. So if that's something that your student is looking for, you might want to be looking at a school that has one of those. Other schools have, through their disability support offices, they have peer mentoring programs. And so you can look to see if the school that you're interested in, if their disability support office has a peer mentoring program. Like I mentioned before, you might also just want to ask the disability support office if they can connect you with other students who use wheelchairs who are currently on campus, to see if you might find some connections there, or you can ask those students some questions about their experience as well, and that can be really valuable.
Thank you, Annie. I have another question from Jennifer. And you can answer it, but I think that it's very important that we make this highlight because our services are really for a host of different students. So she asked, is this program relevant to students with neuromuscular disorders or only those with spinal cord injury?
That is a fantastic question.
Indeed.
So for this program, the Reeve Foundation is broadly defining paralysis. So a student who experiences any type of paralysis, it doesn't have to be a spinal cord injury. Through this project, I've worked with students with cerebral palsy, with spinal muscular atrophy, with other neuromuscular disorders. So the best suggestion would be to contact the Reeve information specialist to see if the student would qualify for this program. And I'm so glad that person asked that question, because I can understand how that might be confusing for people. So thank you for asking that question, and just call or connect with the information specialist to get that sorted out. Yeah.
Thank you. And please remember that the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation works with people of all types of paralysis and mobility impairments. So most certainly we do have a host of resources in our programs that address all types of paralysis. So all of our other questions have already been answered. Annie, you have been great. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today. I hope that everybody found this information useful, and don't forget to connect with us. Contact our information specialist team. You can also connect with us through our forum, Reeve Connect, if you have any questions or just to share your experiences as well.
Thanks, everybody. Keep in touch.
Thank you.